They say the view from the top is lonely. I don't know if that's true, but as I stand by the floor-to-ceiling glass of my office, watching the city lights pulse like a heartbeat, I can't help but smile. This skyline, these streets, these buildings, they answer to me now. Funny thing is, no one ever expected I'd get here. Least of all my family. Least of all my cousin. The silk of my blouse whispers against my skin as I shift, cradling the coffee mug that's long since gone cold. I glance at my reflection in the glass. Calm, poised, untouchable. That's the image I've crafted. But behind my eyes, there's a truth I've kept hidden for years. My phone buzzes against the mahogany desk. A name flashes on the screen, one I never thought I'd see again. Ethan Carter. My cousin. The boy who once laughed in my face as he signed the papers that stripped me of everything. The man who took my land, my one inheritance, and left me standing with nothing but shame. I inhale sharply, the bitter edge of coffee lingering on my tongue. Part of me wants to let it go to voicemail, to leave the past buried where it belongs. But another part, the one that's carried me this far, knows better. Because sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. Sometimes it calls you directly, demanding to be answered. And tonight, I'm ready. I was 21 when it happened, old enough to dream, but too young to understand how cruel family could be when money and pride were at stake. The land wasn't much by anyone else's standards, just a stretch of soil on the outskirts of town, an old farmhouse, and a few oak trees my grandmother used to say were older than the city itself. But to me, it was everything. It was my inheritance, my anchor, my piece of the world where I thought I could build a life. I still remember the day Ethan showed up at the porch, papers in hand. His smile so slick it felt rehearsed. "It's just business, Claire," he said, sliding the documents across the wooden table like he was doing me a favor. My hands shook as I read the words I barely understood. Transfer, relinquish, ownership. He leaned back, arms folded, watching me crumble. When I refused to sign, he laughed. "You're naive. You don't know what to do with this land. I'll take care of it. Besides, family should trust family." By the time I realized what he'd done, it was over. He had gone behind my back, convincing my mother that it was for the best. The papers were already filed. The land, my land, was gone. I remember running into my grandmother's room that night, choking on sobs. She didn't say much, just handed me a small silver key attached to a thin chain. "Doors closed, child," she whispered, pressing it into my palm. "But there are always others waiting to be opened. Promise me, you won't stop looking." That key burned against my skin, a reminder of everything I had lost and everything I could still fight for. Standing in that dark room, the weight of betrayal pressing down on me, I made myself a vow. If they could strip me of land, I would claim something greater. If they thought I was small, I would grow so large they'd have no choice but to look up. I didn't know how. I didn't know when. But that night, at 21, with tears streaking down my face and a key clutched tight in my fist, I promised myself this. One day, Ethan Carter would see me rise. Starting over felt like stepping into a storm without an umbrella. I had no land, no safety net, and barely a few $100s saved. What I did have was stubbornness, the kind that kept me moving even when everyone around me expected me to crawl back in shame. I rented a tiny one-bedroom apartment in downtown Phoenix. The walls were thin, the carpet smelled faintly of mildew, and the faucet dripped through the night. But it was mine. For weeks, I lived off canned soup and instant coffee, working part-time at a bookstore just to pay rent. But late at night, when the world was quiet, I sat at the borrowed desk in the corner and searched endlessly on an old laptop. Real estate, business licensing, urban development. I devoured every scrap of information I could find, hungry to turn knowledge into power. That was when I met Margaret Lewis. She was a sharp, seasoned real estate broker, with silver hair always pinned back and a gaze that saw straight through excuses. I'd applied for an assistant position in her firm, and she almost tossed my resume aside. But something in my eyes must have convinced her, because she gave me a chance. "Don't waste it," she warned. The work was grueling. Early mornings, endless paperwork, coffee runs, answering phones with a voice steadier than my nerves. But Margaret didn't believe in coddling. She believed in throwing me into the fire and watching if I burned or learned. And I learned. I learned how to read property contracts like second nature. I learned to calculate numbers in my head faster than most people used a calculator. I learned how to negotiate, how to make people lean in when I spoke, and most importantly, how to spot an opportunity when others overlooked it. The first time I closed a deal on my own, my hands were trembling under the desk. It wasn't a mansion or a skyscraper, just a small duplex sold to a young couple. My commission check wasn't much, but I framed the stub anyway, tucking it behind a row of books where no one else could see. To me, it was proof I could do this. Over the next few years, I climbed quietly, deliberately. I worked 2 jobs, saved every dollar, and invested in properties no one else wanted. Abandoned warehouses, crumbling apartments, forgotten corners of the city. Where others saw ruin, I saw potential. And slowly, brick by brick, I built a foundation stronger than land alone. Through it all, I kept my success hidden. On family calls, I spoke casually, saying I was doing fine, never offering details. On social media, I posted nothing more than coffee cups and sunsets. I let them believe I was small, struggling, insignificant. Because deep down, I wanted the reveal to be sharp, undeniable, unforgettable. And every time exhaustion threatened to swallow me, I reached for the silver key hanging from my necklace. It had no lock, no purpose except the promise tied to it. Each time my fingers brushed it, I remembered my vow. One day, Ethan Carter will see me rise. And I wasn't just rising. I was preparing to soar. The message came through Margaret's old secretary. Your cousin Ethan Carter would like to meet you. Urgent. For a moment, I stared at the words, my chest tightening the way it used to when I was 21, clutching that silver key in the dark. But then I laughed softly. Time had flipped the script. He was coming to me now. 2 days later, I was in my office, a top-floor corner suite overlooking Phoenix. Sunlight spilled across glass walls, catching on the steel and marble that filled the space. My desk was polished walnut, my bookshelves lined with framed contracts, awards, and quiet reminders of the empire I'd built. Behind me, the city stretched endlessly, humming with life. The door opened and Ethan stepped in. He looked older, lines etched around his mouth, hair thinning at the temples, but the arrogance was still there, the same swagger I remembered from that farmhouse porch. Except now, there was something else in his eyes. Desperation. He wasn't alone. My mother trailed behind him, her eyes darting nervously around the room as though afraid to touch anything. And with them came 2 other relatives, faces I hadn't seen in years, faces that had once looked away while I was broken. For a moment, silence filled the room. I let it linger, savoring it. The tick of the clock. The soft hum of the city below. Ethan's eyes flicking from the skyline view to the leather chairs, to the expensive art on the walls. This is your office? He finally asked, his voice unsteady. I leaned back in my chair, crossing one leg over the other. It is. Welcome to Carter Holdings.
His jaw tightened.
Carter. Yes. My smile was small but sharp. I kept the name. I thought it fitting, since I own more of this city now than anyone else with it. His face went pale. I let him sit in silence, let the weight of the truth settle like dust in the air. My mother looked between us, confusion and guilt warring on her face. The other 2 whispered, their voices trembling with disbelief. You own this? Ethan asked finally, gesturing vaguely at the skyline behind me. I stood, walking to the glass wall. Not all of it. Not yet. But enough. Enough to know that the land you stole from me was nothing more than a spark. I built the fire. I took warehouses and crumbling apartments and turned them into gold. I took corners of this city no one wanted and made them mine. And now, the city runs through me. The room was so quiet I could hear Ethan's shallow breathing. Claire, my mother's voice cracked. Why didn't you ever tell us? I turned, meeting her gaze. Because you didn't want to know. Because when I begged for help, you looked away. When I cried, you told me to grow up. So I did. Ethan shifted in his seat, his bravado crumbling. I didn't know it would come to this. I was just protecting yourself. I cut in, my tone crisp. Don't rewrite history, Ethan. You stole from me because you thought I was too weak, too naive, too young to fight back. And maybe I was. Back then. I stepped closer, the silver key at my neck catching the light. But I'm not weak anymore. Look around you. This city is mine. And the ground you thought you buried me in? It's the very foundation I built all this on. Ethan looked away, shame darkening his face. For once, he had no clever retort. I let the silence stretch again because silence was power. Then, softly, deliberately, I delivered the truth they couldn't escape. My cousin took my land. Now, I own the city. The words hung in the air like thunder, final and undeniable. And for the first time in my life, Ethan Carter looked small. For a long moment, no one spoke. The weight of my words seemed to press down on them heavier than the glass tower we stood in. Ethan's hands gripped the armrests of the chair, his knuckles pale. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a crumpled tissue. The others shifted uncomfortably, caught between awe and shame. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. Claire, I came because I need help. There it was. The arrogance was gone, replaced with something raw. Desperation. I tilted my head, studying him. Help. From me. He swallowed. The land, my projects, they're falling apart. Bad investments, wrong partners. I'm drowning, Claire. You have the power to fix it. If you would just, he trailed off, glancing at the skyline again. A bitter laugh rose in my throat, but I swallowed it back. I could have gloated. I could have said no. But power is not about cruelty. It's about choice. I walked slowly around the desk, the silver key tapping softly against my necklace. You're right, I said. I could help you. But I won't, unless you accept my conditions. His jaw tightened, but he nodded. First, I began, my voice steady. You will admit to me, to the family, to yourself, that you stole what wasn't yours. No excuses. No rewriting history. He flinched, but remained silent. Second, you will rebuild, not with greed, not with shortcuts, but with humility. Volunteer, invest in communities you once overlooked. Learn what it means to give before you take. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. Third, I continued, turning my gaze to the others, this isn't just for Ethan. All of you who turned away when I needed you, you will change, too. No more gossip. No more dismissing me or anyone because they're young or unproven. If you want a place in my life, you will live with honesty and respect. My mother's lip trembled. Claire, we failed you. I softened my tone but kept my spine straight. Yes, but you can do better now. You can support others the way you didn't support me. That's my condition for you. Ethan's voice was rough when he finally spoke. And if we agree? I looked him square in the eyes. Then I'll help. Not by handing you success, but by guiding you to earn it. I'll open doors, but you'll walk through them yourself. If you want to rise, it won't be on my shoulders. It will be on your own. Silence stretched again, but this time, it wasn't heavy. It was transformative, a crack in the wall that had stood between us for years. Ethan dropped his gaze, shoulders sagging. My mother nodded through her tears. The others shifted, murmuring words of agreement. I breathed deeply, feeling the weight lift from me. This was my victory, not just owning buildings and contracts, but owning my story, my conditions, my worth. For the first time, they weren't dictating my future. I was dictating theirs. In the weeks that followed, I began to see small changes. Ethan called me, not to beg, not to scheme, but to ask questions. Real questions. About how to rebuild, how to approach people with integrity instead of arrogance. The conversations were awkward at first, but there was humility in his tone that I'd never heard before. My mother, too, tried. She sent me clumsy text messages, recipes she thought I might like, old photos of me as a child, short notes that ended with "I'm proud of you." They were small steps, but they mattered. For the first time, I felt she was reaching toward me instead of pulling away. Even the relatives who once whispered about my failures now came with different words. Respect. Curiosity. Sometimes even admiration. I didn't embrace them all at once, it wasn't that simple, but I let the walls lower, brick by brick. One evening, after a long day of meetings, I found myself alone in my office. The city stretched beneath me, glowing in the twilight, alive with a pulse that felt almost like my own heartbeat. I slipped the silver key from around my neck and held it in my palm. It was scratched now, worn from years of being clutched through hard nights and quiet victories. But as I stared at it, I understood what my grandmother had meant. It was never about a literal door. It was about possibility, about resilience, about remembering that even when one door slams shut, another waits to be found, if you have the courage to look. Tears stung my eyes, but they weren't from pain this time. They were from pride, from gratitude, from knowing that the girl who once stood trembling in the shadows had grown into a woman standing tall above the skyline. I tucked the key back against my heart and whispered, softly but firmly, "Thank you, Grandma. You were right." The city lights shimmered back at me, as if answering. And then, with the kind of certainty that only comes from surviving the fire, I gave the world my final truth. My cousin took my land, but I built an empire from the ashes. And now, the city itself belongs to me.